Welcome back to the show, everyone. Dana and I are back for another episode. How are you, Dana?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic because I'm with you, Dana. And it's always a hoot when we're together.
Well, I feel the same way. I feel like since we're both wearing black and white today, which we
We
didn't
didn't even
coordinate, by the
plan it.
way. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're just mind melded. We should
We're
talk
yeah,
about a
we're
black and
vibing.
white topic, like black and white thinking in and out groups. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good segue.
Dana,
Yeah.
Dana, that segue, like mind blown.
In and out
You-
groups, not to be confused with In and Out Burger, which I hear are
which I
very good,
love.
but yeah, I've never had one.
What? You haven't had an In-N-Out burger?
No. Well, now I'm a vegetarian, but even in my history, we don't have them here in Seattle. We don't. I actually think they may have built the first one somewhere south of here, but I've never had one.
I know it's a California thing. I do
Yeah.
know that like
Yeah.
In-N-Out and like there is a hamburger debate across the
Yeah.
nation. It's like In-N-Out versus White Castle, which by the way, I had a White Castle burger. That is disgusting. I'm
Yeah.
sorry for those of you that like White Castle. I'm like, that's a steamed, smushy mess. I just don't. I'm so sorry. I'm so
See,
sorry.
this is we're giving examples of like biases in in-group, out-group. When I
Yeah.
first moved out here to Seattle from Chicago, I was so
Yeah.
depressed because I couldn't find a decent pizza. And people are like, "Oh, we have pizza," and I'm like, "This is not pizza."
No, you don't have
I'm sorry.
pizza.
And we actually now FedEx pizzas from Chicago, especially from a place now because I can't eat gluten, and we have our favorite place makes gluten-free ones, and we get them FedExed. So, the point we're trying to make, we actually are going to be talking about a psychological construct here, really biases and like what I know versus what's out here, and this
Yeah.
social idea of in-group, out-group.
Yep.
We learned about this in graduate school and even undergrad, like the idea of why humans formed communities and tribes and how they tended to survive better when they were with like-minded people. So there's a little bit of our kind of genetics that drive being with people who are similar or part of our group, right? But now that can become what we call, social psychologists call in-grouping and out-grouping. And we're seeing a lot of that in politics now.
Yep.
We're seeing a lot of that with the racial strain we're having in this country. We're seeing a lot of that with LGBT plus folks and non-LGBT folks. We're just getting, sadly, way too many current examples of in-group, out-group. And it really is, my mom used to always say, everything's about fear. And, my mom was a character and very black and white or thinking. And back then I'd be like, oh, for God's sake. And she was right. She was actually right. So everything that like is in-group, out-group is fear of the unknown, or fear of somehow if I understand the other group, I'm going to lose me, right?
Yeah.
Because it goes beyond just you're different than me. Because what blocks you from wanting to learn about the other person? Well, then you make them human, and then maybe you have to be nice. But there's been stuff written about how people have like this idea of social contagion, right? Like somehow something's going to be contagious and it's going to change my worldview. And it really, by fear, it's this unnamed thing. Because I'll do exercises with people that will say like, well, and then what would happen? And then what would happen?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't do that. They just go to that one kind of murky, something bad. And they just stay with that ball of fear of the unknown. And then they never go beyond and actually, well, what would happen? Because if you do that, then you'd be like, oh, I'd be okay, ultimately. But we have a primary hardwired sense to be afraid of the other. But we also now have this huge evolved neocortex and frontal lobe that is supposed to have us be able to get beyond that, right? And be able to understand differences. And actually, we were Googling a bunch of different search terms before we came on here to look at different maps of acceptance, or like stages of moving through biases. And every discipline has its own version of that. Like there's one with LGBT identity, there's one with racial identity and these kinds of things, where it starts out as you're the other and you're horrible and bad and I don't want to have anything to do with you. In the middle somewhere is the proverbial, the differences shouldn't matter, we should all get along, which is sort of like cultural erasure. then I'm not seeing that you have differences and you're living under different pressures than I am. As a white person, a Black person is identifiable as a minority and they're living in a different soup than I am because I'm not a person of color. So that one's a big block for people. Well, I'm just going to treat everybody the same. Yeah, but we're not swimming in the same waters. You can't really do that, right? And then all the way to not just acceptance, but actually being celebratory of differences, and that diversity is a good thing. And there's even a model for neurodivergence and neurodiversity around that as well, that it isn't just this person has a disability and, oh, damn, now we have to help them. It's about this different way of being should be celebrated, and that voice should be included because it's a different perspective. And we are a group of humans that all have different perspectives, and we should listen to the different perspectives so that everybody has a voice. So that's like the other end of the spectrum around that, using the word spectrum because we're talking about autism spectrum, so that works.
Yeah.
But you see that in a lot of different models of like who we are versus who they are. And some of the, how do we see the other? And then you and I, before we came on, we're talking about biases, right? And those sort of systematic oppressive biases. You were mentioning the practice of redlining, where they would actually not allow people of color to buy houses in certain areas. And even though that is no longer outwardly the case, you can see these ripples in neighborhoods in almost every place you live, especially in larger cities, right? I think it's interesting that I remember learning this in grad school. Why is it always the South Side? Why is it the South Side of some big city that's always the crappy place? Because the wind would blow that way. And in the industrial age, the South Side was where no one wanted to live because it was toxic to live there. So that's where all the poor families ended up. That's why almost every major city, it's the South Side that is the poor neighborhood. And I'm like, oh my God. I remember having a light bulb go on in grad school, like, you have got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
And I tried really hard not to say the F word right there, so you didn't have to go find it and bleep it out.
You know what, Dina, you have trained me. I can edit out a good old F-bomb in about under 2 minutes. Like nice. I got it down now. Dina's
you know
trained
where they are
me.
now. Yeah.
You know, I think, so Dina, okay, so we're talking about these social psychology constructs of in-group and out-group, right?
Yeah.
In-group, and this really has to do with identity. I identify with this group of people, and the out-group is I don't identify with those people.
Yeah.
And this kind of black and white dichotomous thinking is challenging. And we see this kind of rippling throughout the United States right now.
Yeah.
I think the other piece that I would like to acknowledge is there is a reason why our brain relies on stereotypes, right? Because our brain wants things to be easy.
Yeah. Wants to categorize so we don't have to think hard every time.
Right. Yeah. Right. It allows the brain. And I really feel like the brain is, and the more and more that I support adults with ADHD, the more I understand this, which is the brain is a meaning maker. It is not meant for remembering the small details and the changes in your schedule. Like that stuff needs to be externally captured. Yeah. But the brain is always seeking to understand.
Categorize, right? To make it more efficient.
Yeah. And so that's really more of an efficient thing. And so you do need, in order for you to override then biases, inherent ones. And when we say inherent biases, these are biases that you are not consciously aware of, but they're biases that you might have been raised with and never knew. I was. Yeah. I absolutely was raised with biases.
We all were. We all are. It's out there. Yep.
Yeah. But it really does take work to uncover how you think about something and how that then bumps up against your family, your immediate environment, your environment, your city, your community, your world. Let's just say, it does take effort and safe spaces to do that. Yeah. And we're seeing that less and less, I think, today. But in-group, out-group is a natural, reflexive thing that we do as human beings. And in order for us to get to that inclusive let's accept that diversity is a part,
Right.
a natural, normal part of the world. We actually have to work at it.
We do.
That's where I feel really sad. I feel really discouraged by that. I do. Because not everyone's willing to work at this.
But also what we see, at least in this country, people taking advantage of and exploiting the idea of that basic me and them. And that's, we see that politically, where the message becomes fanning the flames of differences as a way to get elected, for example, let's say. But what it does, what I'm starting to take some solace in now, is as polarized as this country is getting on multiple issues, right? Studies are starting to come out now where when you poll people that live in those states, for example, the majority of people do not feel like we're seeing in the news headlines every day. So for example, like my dad lives in Florida. My sister's planning on moving there in about a year. I have quite a few friends that live down there. My dad lives down there. I might have already said that. Just because of the messages we hear coming out of there and the laws they're passing, the vast majority of people that live there are not okay with what's happening, right? And so you can also have, we go back to World War II and the message of the Third Reich, right? Most people that lived in Germany at the time did not agree with Hitler's mission. And that took really systematic curtailing and systematic curating to manipulate people on a mass level to get them all in that one big giant groupthink, and in that extreme of an aversion of groupthink, to have such hate for another group that they were willing to eradicate them or try to eradicate them, right? That's what we're capable of to that degree, which is really scary. And then on the other end, like you're saying, it does take work because we all grow up in our own little ponds, and we all grow up with biases, these systematic biases, these automatic biases, those kinds of things. And like you said, it's an efficient way of thinking. I've seen this in terms of neurodiversity, where I gave this example before we logged on here. I had a friend of a friend ask if I thought the Ted Lasso character was autistic. And I, perplexed, said, no, of course not. I'm curious though, why did you think that? And that person said, well, because he never gets mad. And part of me was like, well, that's dumb. But then the other part of me is like, oh, damn, there it is again. Someone that has a completely stereotyped view of something. And not only is it it isn't really the stereotype view, but in that person's head, that's what autism is, like this flat.
Yeah.
And like The Good Doctor, I haven't watched that show because I just can't. I think I watched one episode, but my understanding is he's very robotic and kind of flat. And it's like, oh, okay, so there is a stereotype out there that exists with that, and that's why that person was thinking that, right? So that person would need to hunt and look for that information to challenge that, basic assumption that is that way of the brain organizing things so it can be more efficient, right?
Right. Which hats off to that person to at least reach out and ask.
Well, that's true. That's true.
You know?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
And maybe that person would, at least do a Google search, although that's sort of scary too, because you get things on the internet that are very marginalizing. But that basic idea of, I think that's why, and we've talked about this a couple podcasts ago, why social media has changed a lot of that. Certainly it's helped people polarize, because now you can find other people that have the same biases you do. And if it's sort of this hate message, this is where you hear how people get radicalized on the internet. That's what's going on. They're only looking at and listening to and seeking out information that is in line with their already existing view. And that can be dangerous, because now it reinforces it and says, oh, other people feel the same way. But it really, in reality, is this tiny little slice of these people that don't live anywhere near each other. Whereas before the internet, you really only had the pond of people that you saw on a daily basis, or maybe like lived in your city or whatever. So it's allowed some of that indoctrination or that reinforcement of those stereotypes. There's a reason people can get radicalized on the internet, right?
Well, and the algorithms are specifically putting the same information in front of those people. So
exactly.
It kind of facilitates more of that echo chamber.
Totally. Yeah.
You know.
Right. And then so
Yeah.
the other thing is having to seek out information on things, something like TikTok or people that are self-diagnosing, or we have people commenting on our podcast saying, "Oh yeah, I started to see videos on this and started to think, wow, I really identify with that." And that's how a lot of people
Yeah.
actually find their pond or their fellow peeps of neurodiversity, because they're
Yeah.
like, oh, and it's so compelling because it isn't like reading a textbook or some neurotypical writing about autistic kids. It's people's lived experiences. And so
Yeah.
those are straight from the mouth of the person who should be giving the message, right?
Yeah.
I shouldn't be doing research on the Asian experience in the United States as a white person. And we can laugh at it, but it doesn't take too far back to see it's all the white people doing all that research on all those groups and saying, oh, well, are you kidding? I mean, it flies in the face of reason, right?
Do you know, this is why I love, and Dana and I spoke about this offline, but I have seen Across the Spider-Verse, and
Yeah.
I'm a fan of this, the Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse. And Dana and I had spoken as well about kind of representation in a different
Yeah.
episode. And I was talking about, I don't just want representation. I want good representation. Like
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Accurate. Yeah.
right. Across the Spider-Verse, I think, does this so beautifully. But the thing that the directors did is they brought in, so there's an Eastern Indian, Asian Indian Spider-Man in this,
Oh,
in
yeah.
Across the Spider-Verse. And they brought, first of all, it is an actor of that descent.
No, yeah, not
And
a
they
white
brought-
person in a makeup,
right?
right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they brought him in and they just said, talk to me about what he would naturally say.
Nice. Yeah.
What happens in your community? What
Yeah.
And so there's all these really cute things, and I won't do any spoilers because I hate people who spoil
Mhm.
movies. But there's all these things where you're like, it feels very authentically represented.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whether that's, Miles's family in Brooklyn to
Yeah.
this person, to that universe that has,
Mhm.
this cultural context, or even, another that's their world. It gets represented so beautifully. They even did that with
Nice.
Rio, Miles's mom, who was like,
Nice.
what are some of the endearing things that you would say to a son?
Oh,
And
nice.
she's like, no one's going to understand this. No one's going to understand these words. And what the director said is, if only 10% understand it,
because
it's worth it.
Representation.
It's worth it.
So it's people from those groups having representation. It's also a chance for someone like me to see the other and go, oh, I didn't know that. Cool. Right. But that again is with years of wanting to be uncomfortable, because I know that there's good riches on the other end of that, wanting to go outside of what I'm used to and challenge that. Does that mean that I will ever eat sushi ever in my life?
No. Right.
No, because I don't like fish. Too slimy, right? That doesn't mean that it's not a fundamental part of some culture, for example, right?
Yeah.
So I'd still want to learn about sushi, and my friends that eat it, like, oh, tell me about why you like that and what the experience of that is, and what it means to your culture and what it means to your family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
I had a friend of mine in grad school once came in one day, was so excited because she finally rolled one tight enough. And I was like, she was so excited. I'm like, oh, okay.
I can relate
you
to
don't
this.
understand. This is a big deal, right?
It's a big deal. And you got to do it with a mat is all I'm going to say. But that's
So that's a really good example, right? Of like, oh, tell me about why that's so important. I want
curiosity.
To know. Yeah. Versus looking at her really weird, like, what the hell? Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's that and we talk a lot about this thematically on the show. Mm-hmm. Curiosity over judgment.
Yeah.
In judgment, we think we know everything already, but in curiosity, we want to know. We want to know those other factors, and that's scary. That's a vulnerable position, and that's a scary position. And I think, there's a big problem today as well of what do we do with those big emotions? How have we been taught? Because those are taught skills. What do we do with big emotions? How do we accept them? How do we accept that distress is part of life and growth? How do we do that? How do we think about things, But But what we see, I think, a lot of times is this stress response because it is the unknown and I don't know what to make of it. And I will say, you know, being an immigrant, as a child, I didn't know because I didn't realize that we lived in a very poor part of Calgary. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I went back and I saw the neighborhood that I was raised in, and I was surrounded by, like, my neighbor was from Trinidad, my other neighbor was from Italy, my other neighbor was from India. I mean, like, it was, you know, but I didn't know. And so I just thought that Calgary was this very it's, by the way, not. It, you know, it wasn't till I was older and I went back and I was like, wow, this is a predominantly white place.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's all, I didn't know that because of where we lived. But I mean, to this day, while, and people make fun of, you know, they'll be like, oh, you're so sensitive with these microaggressions. But I'm like, microaggressions exist.
Yeah.
Because of this in-group, out-group bias.
Right.
And like we even know too, like neurologically, your perception of your in-group is different than your perception of out-group. Neurologically. I mean, we're talking milliseconds of perception.
Yeah. There's been studies that you can have someone that has grown up in Asian culture and can, I'm prefacing this with, please bear with me because it's going to sound horrible when I start to say it, but I'm going to get beyond that. In the old days, like my dad used to say about Asians, oh, they all look the same. And then you learn, like, well, that's a terrible thing to say. And then you learn, oh, there's a nugget of truth in there, in that if you grow up in an Asian culture and you can see the subtleties of those faces, your brain is not wired. If I didn't grow up with a lot of Asian friends, my brain is not wired to see those differences. My brain is wired to see differences in faces of white people, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean I can't learn that later, but that by no means means you all look the same, sort of like inherently, right? See what I'm saying? Yep. So people then would say, oh, well, no, this research says that you can't see the differences. I'm like, no, you're saying you're taking the findings out of context. And there's so many ways you can take all these little bits of information and really use them in horrible ways, or you could try to use them in ways that promote more understanding. Like, oh, okay, that's why I have that experience. Okay, I get it. And now I can actually try to work to get beyond that instead of staying stuck in my stereotype, if that makes sense.
And I think what you're also saying too, Dana, is this is why it takes some energy and effort.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Because our wiring is such, you know? And I mean, and I would never, as an Asian person, it's funny because my culture, like ethnically I'm Chinese, but culturally I'm Malaysian. My family were some of the first Chinese immigrants to Malaysia. So we don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese, right? We don't also have similar food. Our food looks more like, it's more, I think it's tight. It's like maybe closer to Indonesian food because of our geographical location.
Yeah, where you were located. Yeah.
You know, but and so that's really odd. No one can usually guess what my ethnic background is, but you know, it's so interesting to me because the differences, and you and I were talking about American-born Chinese earlier too, and that I was a little bit confused, you know, just because of my my own understanding of like the difference between different Chinese subgroups, right? But anyway,
look on a map. It's a massive country. They're not all the same.
By any means. Yeah, by any means. And people who are from China can tell the difference between people from different places in the subgroups. They can tell. I'm not one of those people because I'm not. I don't have any experience living in China or being raised in China. And But it's interesting because people will say to me and you know, they'll just assume that. And so that's also interesting too, right? But you know, these things exist for a reason. It exists for us to function. Yeah. And so if we can just accept that we have biases, like we have them.
Yep.
Whether it's ethnic or neurological or gender or sex or whatever it is, if we can appreciate that we have biases and they exist for a reason, then maybe we can say, wow, I'm going to challenge that.
Yeah. Yeah. And want to challenge that, right?
Yeah.
And know that
Yeah.
these folks are out there and you want to learn about that. And
Yeah.
I see that with myself. I see that with my neurodivergent students, that I
Mhm.
can see, like, when we're all in a group together, it's just like, it's not, we don't have any reciprocity issues. Everybody magically knows how to talk when. It's really interesting. But then I can see when they're in the neurotypical milieu, it's a struggle, right? There are all those biases and assumptions. And we hope to foster, but it's hard because some of the faculty don't even do this, is to, like you said, promote that curiosity. Have someone ask. I had one of my students kind of get a stereotype view back from a fellow student. And I said, well, what did you do? Just, well, I just shrunk and felt horrible and didn't say anything. And I was like, oh God, I totally get that, because it's so much work to be the member of that group and then have to educate the other one. But an opportunity came along again to challenge that. Maybe challenge is too strong of a word, but to say, you might not be thinking outside of your box. And she just said, not, it is a spectrum. There's a reason to use that word, not because the other person has a autistic little brother who has very high support needs and has a lot of co-occurring medical issues.
Yeah.
And so since her fellow student doesn't have that, that was her view of autism, right? So she could just say, you might want to look into and understand the full spectrum, right? And I haven't heard a report back to see if that person's done that, but that should be happening in a psych program, right? That person should say, oh God, this member of a group told me I have some learning to do. To me, when I have that happen, I take that as a great opportunity to learn something, right?
Yeah.
I can remember saying in a faculty meeting once, oh, we need to circle the wagons. And then my chair, who's a person of color, messaged me on Zoom and said, that's not a great phrase to use. A, I was mortified, like, oh crap, I did a really bad thing. But B, I was like, oh, wait, this is a learning
Right.
opportunity. This
Right.
is so part of my lexicon without, like, the microaggression, without even thinking about it. And
Yeah.
I've caught myself a couple times now, like, oh my
Yeah.
God, look, what am I saying? But that was from my upbringing. My parents said that. Everybody in my generation said that. And I'm like, well, what? You can just say, can we circle back to that idea? Because circling the wagons means something totally different,
Yeah.
right? And that's such a good example of me having rapport with my fellow faculty, that he felt comfortable to say, because he knew that I was going to take it as a learning opportunity, because we've established that between the two of us, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I've done that with him in terms of a women's experience and a queer person's experience and so on. And that's that's sort of the heart that you have to go into these things with. I know that there's going to be a lot of our listeners who are neurodivergent themselves and have had and experienced a lot of wounding when they've gone and told friends or family. Actually, friends are usually pretty supportive. You usually surround yourself by fellow neurodivergents without even knowing it. But family, a lot of times, is going to give you crap or not understand you, or a stranger on the bus because you're stimming is going to be staring at you like you're crazy. That's that in and out group thing at operation. You're seeing it in real time happen, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're defective or something's wrong with you. It means that person doesn't know how to deal with the other. That's basically what that's saying, right?
Yep. And we're not, the other thing I think I'll speak for myself. I'm not saying that we need to walk around on eggshells because of what we might say.
Right.
I am saying, though, when someone does bring it up with you as a request, I think
make an effort.
I want to make an effort, and I want to meet that person. I think that's very brave and courageous to say something.
Yeah.
And if someone prefers to be called something different,
yeah.
So I do too, Dana. I have a lot of sayings that I make that I might not always get called up on, but like after I get off a meeting or something, I'll inevitably be like, well, that was a foot in the mouth moment, like Gwen. Just because I picked it up myself, like no one said anything to me, but I kind of picked that up. And but we do, we have in these kind of inherent biases that we don't are not always conscious of, right?
Yeah.
How could we not? How could we not? And
well,
so
we hear people say, "Ooh, everything's PC," like you said, or someone saying you're so sensitive to microaggressions. I think it's good to be aware of those things. I think that starts to change our environment with our fellow humans to one that is recognizing those differences. I take a lot of solace in my 20-somes that are more and more in my program as I continue to age, and they stay the same age.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And that they're growing up with much more awareness than I did. And I take solace in that every day. It's like, oh, cool.
Agreed.
Even the ones that grew up in white bread suburbia are getting the message of it's not all about you. You need, and that's fantastic. And I think it's great. And I also think it's why we're seeing various cultures throughout the world that are westernized have this rubber band effect because the people in power are scared. They're no longer going to be the majority, and they're freaking out, and they're whipping up the flames of the other because they know it works. We're seeing that with banning drag shows and banning books and trans bans, and it's just unbelievable. Those are massive versions of the other that we're seeing in real time. And you're living through the wounding of what's happening with those. You read about a lot of those things probably in school, and now you're living through one. So lucky for you, you know what the lived experience is like now. Horribly.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I say to my teenager all the time, thank goodness your generation
is more
is moving into this space of diversity, inclusion. Because it's, whenever the pendulum swings, there's drama.
There is that in group backlash. That's kind of what humans do. Yeah.
Yep. It's what happens in pendulum swings and paradigm shifts. And we know this throughout history, and we understand this psychologically. Actually, there's been lots of psychological kind of review of this over time. But
it's like our version of cognitive territoriality. It's like in other animals don't reject other animals. Like you're a squirrel and you have more of a black coat than a brown one. Get out of here. It isn't that. It's territoriality, and it's resource-based. It's like, get out of my perimeter.
Get out of my acorn.
I'm not going to have enough food, right? And then now we've done it because we have all these other needs met, and now we're separating out on these things that don't matter, really, but should matter. Because sorry, I totally interrupted you. You just gave me that thought because I started thinking about squirrels. Squirrel.
Wow, how literal.
Hey, I killed two birds with one stone. Oh, that's a terrible saying.
Oh no, wait, that's not a
birds
good
one
either. We'll need to find replacements, Dana. It looks like you need a new repertoire.
Yeah, I know. I still use rule of thumb, and I'm like, damn it, I learned that one 20 years ago. I shouldn't be using rule of thumb.
Oh, man. Well, you know what? And again, for us, it's about remaining open-minded and thoughtful.
Yeah.
Because it's how we want to treat other people and human beings.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's just, it's really comes down to that. I don't think there's more to that. It's just like the same. And if my mom's listening to this podcast, my mom still insists on using the word Oriental. And I say to her, Mom,
it's for rugs now. It's not for people,
right?
It's just for rugs.
I'm just like, Mom, it's like not. I mean, she's the generation she comes from. This was completely acceptable. The Orient Express, the Orient, like whatever. I just say, I think it's not that you don't have to stop using that word. It's just know that has historical context. That for some people it's interesting, but. So for you, Mom, out there, I know she was like, but she keeps saying to me, I'm not using that word. I wanted to use the word Oriental, but I didn't. And I'm like, well, I'm glad because you just used it twice, but fantastic. I'm glad we're thinking about it. Like
you did what's called spitting in her soup in Atlarian. So now it's never quite the same if you've known something.
Nice. Spitting in your soup. Hey, by the way, let's do an episode on spitting in your soup.
It's spitting in your soup.
Write it down.
I will. I'm putting it on our spreadsheet.
Put it on our list. All right, you Marvels out there, be good. Be good to each other. Let's try to just be better. Let's just be
Yeah.
better. Let's be better
And,
humans.
be the 2-year-old. Ask why. Ask
Yeah.
why. Yeah.
Please.
The
Actually,
internet
people
is
appreciate
a
that.
good thing for learning that. And I literally, when we moved into this neighborhood, and the people would stand really close to me in the grocery store because I live in a really nicely multicultural neighborhood. I literally came home and Googled, why do people stand so close to me in the grocery store? And it brought up all these answers about multiculturalism.
Nice.
And then I'm like, oh yeah, duh, personal space, it varies by culture. So yeah,
Absolutely.
be curious.
Oh, yeah.
Try to learn, look stuff up, and just see what you can find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Marvels. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of this community. We love you, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye, everybody.